"This mansion is mine now. Your son is dead. You should get out of here," my daughter-in-law said coldly, pointing straight at my face on the day of my son's funeral. I was not surprised by her insolence, because while she was pointing at me, the money from the sale of this $25 million mansion was already flowing into my account. Let me back up and tell you what happened 1 month ago. The sky above New York was heavy and gray that morning, and the kind of autumn wind that cut straight through fabric swept across the cemetery lawns. I stood among the crowd of mourners, my black dress plain, my silver hair pinned back, my body trembling against the cold. Before me lay the polished mahogany coffin of my only son, Alexander Pierce. It gleamed beneath the weight of white flowers, orchids and roses and lilies that friends and business partners had sent, as if beauty could disguise the cruelty of death. His photograph rested against the flowers, his smile captured forever, radiant and full of promise, a cruel contrast to the grief that swallowed the gathering. I could not weep any more. The tears had dried in me the moment I heard the news that he was gone. For nights I had stared at the ceiling, wrung dry of all emotion, until my face felt carved in stone. I stood slightly apart, near the row of trees that edged the cemetery, because Vivian, my daughter-in-law, had taken the place at the head of the coffin. She sat there like a queen, veiled in a designer dress of jet black, oversized sunglasses hiding most of her face. She dabbed at her eyes with a monogrammed handkerchief, but when she turned her head I caught the subtle twitch of her mouth, the faintest lift at the corner, like the shadow of a smile. The whispers drifted to me. Some were from my own family, voices lowered with pity. "Poor Catherine," they murmured. "She gave her life to that boy, and now she is left alone." Others came from colleagues of my son, standing in stiff clusters in their dark coats. "Such a loss," they said. 42 years old, a career at its peak, fortune in his hands, and now all of it ended in a heartbeat. I wrapped my arms around myself as the priest began the prayers, his voice solemn, echoing over the rows of mourners. Vivian's shoulders shook in a performance of grief, her gloved fingers pressed to her lips, but her body radiated a strange detachment, as though she were less widow than actress. The scent of white roses was thick, mixing with the damp air, making it difficult to breathe. I lowered my eyes to the coffin. Alexander had once told me that success meant nothing without integrity, and now he lay beneath flowers, silent, his ideals buried with him. I tried to imagine that the weight of his life, his wealth, his name, would not simply dissolve into the hands of others who cared little for his soul. My chest ached, but no tears came. Only silence filled me, heavy and cold, as if I too had been buried with him. When the wind rose again and swept the petals across the ground, I felt the sting of the coming storm. Something darker than grief lingered in that air, something sharpened in Vivian's secret smile. The rope slid slowly through the pulleys, and the coffin sank into the dark earth, white petals scattering from the lid as if reluctant to let him go. My knees trembled, and for a moment I thought I would collapse into the open grave with him. The world blurred, not from tears, for I had none left, but from the weight pressing on my chest. A gentle hand touched my arm and steadied me. It was my nephew, his young face pale with sorrow, his voice a whisper close to my ear. "Aunt Catherine, you must hold yourself together," he said softly. "You only have yourself now." Those words struck deeper than any prayer. Only myself. For 63 years I had carried the title of mother, the single role that defined me, and now it was gone. The crowd around me shifted uneasily, the priest closed his book, and the workers prepared to cover the coffin. I swayed, but clung to my nephew's arm, staring at the rectangle of earth that had swallowed my son. The autumn wind bit against my cheeks, and I tasted the raw iron of solitude. I searched the faces gathered near the grave, expecting, perhaps foolishly, that Vivian might approach, might offer a hand or a word, some gesture of shared loss. Instead, she lingered a few paces back, head bowed in what looked like grief. Her black veil fluttered against her cheek, and her hand moved delicately toward her face, dabbing away tears that glistened behind her dark glasses. For an instant I wanted to believe she was mourning, that she was broken as I was. But then my eyes caught the subtle movement of her other hand slipping into the pocket of her tailored coat. Her thumb pressed quickly against the lit screen of a phone, her head lowered just enough to disguise the gesture. The faint glow of the device vanished and her hand stilled. I knew then she was not with me in that moment. While the body of my son descended into the ground, his widow was sending messages to someone unseen, someone waiting for her attention. A shiver colder than the wind ran down my spine. I turned my face away, not because I wished to protect her dignity, but because I could not bear the collision of the sacred and the profane. The mourners began to move back, some touching my shoulder, some murmuring polite words of comfort that fell empty on my ears. My nephew urged me toward the waiting car, but I resisted. I wanted one last look at the mound of earth slowly covering the coffin. I wanted to remember the sound of the dirt falling, the dull thud that marked the end of everything I had lived for. My legs weakened again, and the young man tightened his hold on me. "Please, Aunt," he pleaded, "let us go before the rain begins." I let him guide me, each step heavy, each breath shallow. Behind me I could hear Vivian's heels clicking softly on the stones, precise and composed. When I dared glance back, she lifted her face, her lips still pressed to the handkerchief, but her eyes gleamed not with grief but calculation. It was only a flicker, but it was enough to chill me more than the wind. At the car door I paused, the cemetery stretching behind me, the grave already half hidden under soil. The silence inside me was deafening. I thought of Alexander's voice, how he used to laugh when he called me every Sunday evening, how he promised I would never be alone. Now there was only the echo of that promise, fragile and broken. As I lowered myself into the seat, the weight of the empty years ahead pressed down, and I realized the words of my nephew were true. I had only myself now, and an emptiness wide as the grave that had just closed over my son. The chandeliers glowed warmly above the long dining hall, casting golden light across polished oak tables and velvet chairs. The house was magnificent, a $25 million mansion set deep in the wooded outskirts of New York, filled with priceless paintings and marble floors that gleamed beneath the guests' feet. Yet that night, after the funeral, no wealth or elegance could soften the heaviness that pressed down on everyone inside. Laughter did not belong here. Every whisper seemed subdued, every glass raised more in ritual than celebration. I sat at the far end of the hall near the wide window, away from the clusters of relatives and acquaintances who spoke in hushed voices. From where I sat, I could see the garden outside, where Alexander had once planted trees just for me, telling me they would grow tall enough to shade my favorite bench. Their branches swayed in the autumn wind, silent witnesses to a family gathering turned hollow. My hands lay folded on my lap, still and tired, while my heart felt too heavy to move. From time to time people drifted toward me. A cousin placed her hand gently over mine and murmured, "She has no one to lean on now." Another whispered near the doorway, "Perhaps the daughter-in-law will take care of her," though the tone carried doubt more than comfort. The words reached me as if through a veil, faint and distant, yet I understood the pity in their eyes. I nodded politely, unable to summon anything else. Vivian commanded the center of the room without even trying. Her dress was perfectly cut, her posture elegant, her glass of wine never far from her manicured fingers. She moved among the guests with the grace of a hostess, receiving condolences with a soft tilt of her head, her expression artfully composed. To the untrained eye she looked like the picture of a grieving widow, but I caught the glimmers others missed. The way her eyes lingered too long on the portraits that lined the hall, the way her lips curved almost imperceptibly whenever someone mentioned Alexander's fortune. She had the air of someone not burdened by grief, but calculating her next move. I saw it most clearly when an old business associate of my son approached her. His words of sympathy were brief, and yet Vivian leaned close, her voice low, her smile faint, as though forging alliances in the middle of mourning. When she caught me watching, She lowered her lashes and dabbed theatrically at the corner of her eyes. I turned back to the garden, my chest aching. The warmth of the chandelier light could not reach me where I sat. I remembered the evenings Alexander had invited me to this very table, urging me to taste the dishes his chef prepared, proud of the life he had built. Now the same table stretched long and empty before me, lined with faces uncertain of the future. The murmur of voices continued around me, some sincere, some cautious. A nephew whispered to another, "I wonder who will truly hold the reins now." A family friend sighed, "It is a heavy legacy, and not everyone wishes her well." Their words floated through the air, half hidden, but their eyes kept sliding toward Vivian. She felt it too, but instead of retreating, she lifted her glass, smiling that faint smile, and in that moment the glittering hall seemed colder than the cemetery had been. The murmur of glasses clinking together had just begun to fade when Vivian rose from her chair. She stood tall in the center of the hall, her silk dress catching the light of the chandeliers, her voice carrying over the tables with a sweetness that chilled me. "I know you are grieving, Mother," she said, each word smooth and careful. "But you also need rest, a place of your own, somewhere quiet. This house," she paused deliberately, "this was Alexander's house. Now that he is gone, it belongs to me. I believe it is time for you to move out." The sound in the room died at once. Forks clattered against plates, someone gasped, and the weight of disbelief pressed down heavier than the funeral had. My heart froze inside my chest. I gripped the edge of my handkerchief, the white cloth twisting in my trembling hands. My breath caught, but no words came. An aunt near the corner whispered fiercely to her husband, "How dare she say that here, today of all days?" Another relative set down his glass so hard it cracked. All around me, people shifted in their seats, glancing from Vivian to me, then back again, as if unable to decide which of us was more real, the grieving mother or the widow who had just claimed her dominion. Vivian's face remained composed, serene as a marble statue, yet her eyes glittered with the satisfaction of a conqueror. She took a sip of wine, then continued, her tone still honeyed but each syllable sharp as a blade. "Do not worry," she said. "I will arrange an allowance for you, a generous one. You will be comfortable, but you cannot stay here. I need to move forward with my life, and this house is part of that future." The room seemed to tilt around me. I felt the blood drain from my face, my body shrinking into the chair though I tried to sit tall. My throat burned with words I could not release. For years I had walked these halls, watched my son fill them with laughter and ambition, heard his footsteps echo down the marble staircase. Every painting on the walls, every tree in the garden outside, carried a memory of him and of me. And now his widow dismissed it all with a gesture, as if I were a guest overstaying my welcome. A cousin tried to intervene, her voice shaking. "Perhaps this is not the time to discuss such matters," she urged. But Vivian silenced her with a polite nod, as if acknowledging a child. "It is never the right time for difficult truths," she replied smoothly, "but they must be spoken." I felt my chest tighten, my hands clutching the handkerchief until the fabric cut into my palms. My mind screamed for me to rise, to strike back, to tell her she was nothing without my son, that this house was built on his dreams and my sacrifices. But the grief choked me, held my voice locked in my throat. I sat frozen, the target of her cruelty, while the silence of the family became another kind of judgment. Vivian lowered herself back into her chair with the grace of a victor, lifting her glass once more. Around her, conversation did not resume. The clink of silverware remained absent. Only the echo of her words lingered in the air, heavy, humiliating, undeniable. And I sat in the shadow of them, trembling, as though my son had been buried twice, once in the ground and once in the cold dismissal of his widow. The silence in the hall pressed on me like a weight, all eyes fixed, yet none willing to intervene. My hands trembled against the white cloth in my lap, and though my heart screamed with indignation, my throat was tight with grief. Slowly, carefully, I pushed back the chair. The legs scraped against the polished floor, a sound that cut through the tension. I bowed my head, my voice soft, almost a whisper, I understand. Then, without another word, I turned away from the table. My steps echoed faintly across the vast dining hall. No one followed. No one dared speak. I could feel the air shift behind me, some in the family glancing down at their plates, others pretending to sip their drinks, unwilling to challenge the widow who had claimed the crown. I moved past the portraits that lined the walls, the faces of ancestors watching, silent witnesses to my humiliation. My son's smile looked back at me from a painting in the corner, and I thought, "Forgive me, Alexander, for leaving the battle unfinished." The heavy doors gave way as I pushed them open, and a chill draft met me on the marble steps outside. The night air was sharp, filled with the scent of fallen leaves and distant rain. I drew the shawl tighter around my shoulders, but the cold seeped into my bones. The light from the mansion spilled across the terrace, casting my shadow long and thin across the stone floor. I paused there, small and trembling, a woman stripped of dignity before her own blood. Behind me, faint at first but growing louder, came the sound of laughter. Vivian's laughter. It was light and lilting, perfectly practiced, mingling with the voices of those who had gathered around her. Through the crack of the open doors, I heard her boasting, speaking of new opportunities, of plans she would pursue now that her path was clear. Her words floated outward, careless and cruel. They no longer bothered to pretend. The widow had taken her throne, and the grieving mother was already forgotten. I closed my eyes. The sting of shame burned my skin, but deeper still was the ache of betrayal. To be dismissed so easily, to be discarded like a burden, was more than grief could carry. Yet in that sting, something stirred. A quiet ember, small but steady. I opened my eyes and looked into the darkness of the garden where Alexander had once walked with me. The branches swayed in the night air, and in their rhythm I felt a reminder. I was not finished. My breath steadied as I stood there, though my body shook in the cold. My hands clenched at my sides, no longer clinging to the handkerchief. Somewhere beneath the layers of despair, a thread of resolve began to weave itself through me. The house might echo with Vivian's voice now, but the story was not hers to write, not entirely. I lifted my gaze to the sky, gray clouds drifting across the moon, and for the first time since the coffin had lowered into the ground, I felt something other than sorrow. It was fragile, almost hidden, but it was there, a decision forming, an unwillingness to surrender. I turned slightly, the light of the mansion painting my face in gold, and though my lips did not move, the thought inside me was clear. This is not the end. The days after the funeral stretched long and heavy, each one blurring into the next, the silence of the house louder than any sound. I walked the marble corridors of the mansion as though in a trance, my hand brushing against walls that had once carried the echoes of my son's footsteps. His scent still lingered faintly in the study, a mixture of paper and cologne, as if he had only stepped out for a meeting and would return at any moment. I opened drawers slowly, touched the edges of his neatly stacked files, the pen left uncapped on the desk, and my heart clenched until I thought it would stop. In the evenings, I sat in the library where he used to read late into the night. The leather chair was still angled the way he liked it, facing the fire. I pressed my palm against the worn armrest, imagining his hand there, the weight of his presence filling the room. My eyes wandered to the shelves he had curated, books on finance and art, philosophy and travel, and I heard his voice explaining to me why knowledge was the only true inheritance worth giving. The pain of his absence hollowed me, yet within that emptiness something else stirred, something quiet but insistent. Vivian often moved through the house with the air of ownership, her heels clicking against the marble, her laughter echoing down the halls when she entertained her friends. To them, I was invisible, an old woman fading in the corner, fragile and voiceless. I played my role well. I kept my shoulders hunched, my steps slow, my words few. I allowed them to see weakness, resignation, even defeat. She believed I was harmless, a relic left behind, surviving on borrowed time. But within me, behind the weary eyes and trembling hands, a fire was growing. Alexander had once taken my hands in his and told me, "Mother, Never doubt your strength. You carried me through every hardship, and I believe in you more than anyone." Those words returned to me each night when I lay awake in the wide, empty bed, staring into the dark. I repeated them like a prayer, letting them seep into my bones until the truth of them became harder to ignore. I walked the garden paths he had designed, each tree and stone a reminder of his devotion. He had told me the garden would outlive us both, a legacy of beauty and patience. As the autumn wind stirred the fallen leaves, I felt him near me, urging me not to surrender to despair. I bent down to touch the bark of a tree he had planted with his own hands, and I whispered, "I will not let your faith die with you." By day, I moved like a shadow, careful and subdued, watching as Vivian busied herself with plans and schemes she thought I could not understand. I let her underestimate me, let her revel in her false victory. By night, I gathered strength, piecing together memories and promises, turning grief into resolve. The house might appear to belong to her now, but I knew it held secrets, and among them, the truth my son had left for me. So I endured the whispers, the dismissive glances, the staged sighs of sympathy that painted me as a broken woman. I endured because I knew the role I played was temporary. Behind my silence was a will sharpened by loss. Behind my bowed head was a heart that refused to be erased. And in the solitude of my mourning, I began to prepare. The morning was pale with weak sunlight filtering through the curtains when I heard the knock at my door. I rose slowly from the armchair where I had been dozing, wrapped in silence and fatigue. When I opened the door, Mr. Harland, Alexander's longtime attorney, stood there with a briefcase in hand and an expression both solemn and gentle. "May I come in, Lady Whitmore?" he asked softly. I stepped aside, my heart already tightening with a sense that something long concealed was about to surface. We sat together in the study. The fire had gone cold in the hearth, but the room still held the memory of Alexander's presence, the shelves lined with his books, the faint trace of his cologne. Mr. Harland set the briefcase on the desk and opened it carefully, producing a folder of documents bound neatly and, finally, a sealed envelope. His voice was steady. "Before your son passed, he made arrangements that only you were meant to know." My breath caught. I reached for the envelope with trembling fingers, tracing the familiar handwriting of my son. The lawyer explained as I stared. Alexander had legally transferred ownership of the mansion, along with a controlling share of his company's stock, into my name. It was done quietly, discreetly, just weeks before his death. I turned toward him, stunned. "Why would he keep this from everyone else?" I whispered. Mr. Harlan lowered his eyes. "Because he discovered something that wounded him deeply. He learned of Vivian's infidelity. He feared she would use her position as his widow to seize everything and discard you, the mother who had been his anchor. He wanted to ensure you were protected, that the wealth he built would not vanish into her hands." The words pierced me more sharply than the autumn wind outside. My son had died carrying the burden of betrayal. My fingers broke the seal of the envelope, and inside I found a letter, written in his strong, unmistakable script. My eyes blurred as I read. "Mom, I trust you. Protect what's ours when I'm gone. I know you will make the right choices. You gave me everything, and I want you to have the strength to stand when I cannot. Do not let grief silence you. What I built was never just mine. It was ours." I pressed the letter to my chest, as though it could bring him back, as though his voice were still near. The pain was unbearable, knowing he had suffered such disillusionment, yet his faith in me shone through every word. Tears slid at last, but they were not only of sorrow. They were of resolve. I looked up at the lawyer, my voice steadier than I expected. "She believes I am broken. She thinks this house is hers. But it is not. Alexander trusted me. He gave me this duty, and I will not fail him." Mr. Harlan nodded gravely, his eyes reflecting respect. "You are stronger than she knows, Lady Whitmore, and your son saw that clearly." When he left, I remained alone in the study, the letter open on the desk, the fire still cold. Yet inside me, a flame had been lit. Vivian's laughter still rang faintly from the far side of the house, but now it no longer hollowed me. It only sharpened my purpose. My grief had found a companion, and its name was determination. I folded the letter carefully and whispered into the empty room, "I will protect what is ours, Alexander. I promise you that." The transformation of the house began quietly at first, but soon there was no mistaking it. Vivian walked through the mansion with the stride of a queen who believed she had inherited a kingdom. One morning I found workers arriving at the gates, men carrying rolls of fabric and crates of furniture. The carpets were lifted, the curtains replaced, the old oak chairs Alexander had chosen discarded for sleek, modern pieces Vivian declared fashionable. I stood at the edge of the room while they carried out his favorite armchair, the one where he used to read, and my heart twisted, but she brushed past me with a smile that did not reach her eyes. "It is time for a new era," she said lightly, as if history itself could be erased by her taste. Soon after, the laughter of strangers filled the halls. Vivian invited her friends often, women in glittering dresses and men with too much cologne. She guided them through each room like a hostess at an exhibition. "This house is mine now," she proclaimed, her voice echoing against the marble, and the guests applauded as though they were toasting a victory. I listened from the corner, invisible, each word cutting into me. At night, when the house quieted, the true face of her plans emerged. I once overheard her in the study, her voice low but sharp as she spoke to a man whose presence chilled me. He was her lover, bold enough to step inside my son's home as though it belonged to him. They leaned over the desk that had once been Alexander's, papers spread between them. "We can mortgage the property," Vivian whispered. "The bank will give us millions." He nodded, his hand resting over hers, and she smiled with a hunger I had never seen when she was with my son. Together they plotted how to sell shares of the company, how to raise cash for ventures that had nothing to do with Alexander's legacy. I stood in the hallway, my hand pressed to the wall, my stomach tightening with fury I dared not show. Their arrogance grew bolder each day. The lover came openly now, walking through the front door without hesitation. I once passed him in the corridor. He looked at me as if I were a servant, no greeting, no respect. Vivian laughed when she saw, looping her arm through his as if daring me to protest. She no longer pretended to hide. To her, I was only a shadow, an inconvenience tolerated out of politeness. She whispered to her friends at dinner, "Catherine stays here like a guest, but soon she will find somewhere else." They giggled, casting glances in my direction as though I could not hear. Every corner of the mansion began to bear her imprint. Paintings my son had loved were taken down, replaced with abstract canvases that cost too much but meant nothing. The scent of fresh paint and new fabric hung in the air, drowning out the comfort of memory. She strutted across the marble floors, issuing orders, her voice sharp when she addressed the staff. And when her eyes fell on me, there was no warmth, only cold disdain. I learned to stay quiet, to move along the edges of rooms, letting her believe she had succeeded in pushing me aside. But each insult, each careless laugh, each plan to dismantle what Alexander had built only fed the fire inside me. Vivian thought she was erasing me, reducing me to a relic. What she did not know was that with every scheme, every declaration, she was drawing the battle lines more clearly. And though I appeared frail and forgotten, I carried in my pocket the letter of my son, his words etched into my soul. "Protect what's ours." I intended to do exactly that. The rain had just ended when I asked the driver to take me downtown. Vivian believed I was meeting a doctor, another sign of my supposed fragility, and I let her believe it. Instead, I stepped into the quiet office of Mr. Harland, the family's attorney for more than 3 decades. The reception smelled of old leather and polished wood, a place that carried the weight of secrets. He rose from behind his mahogany desk when I entered, his expression warm but edged with gravity. "Lady Whitmore," he said, "it is good to see you. Please sit." I lowered myself into the chair across from him, my hands folded in my lap. For a moment I felt like a girl again, about to receive news too important for me to understand. But this time, I understood all too well. Mr. Harland opened a folder thick with documents and slid them gently toward me. Your son was thorough. The mansion, the stocks, the accounts, they are all legally in your name. The Diocese of Law has already recognized it. There is no loophole Vivian can exploit. Relief flooded me, though it was bittersweet. Alexander had worked to shield me from betrayal, but in doing so, he had also placed the burden squarely on my shoulders. My fingers brushed over the embossed papers, my name clear and final on the deeds. She believes this house is hers, I whispered. She boasts of it daily. Mr. Harlan leaned forward. Then it may be wise to act before she has the chance to damage its value. If you wish, we can begin the process of a discreet sale. No announcements, no whispers in the press. Quiet buyers, reliable ones. My breath held. The thought of letting go of the mansion, the place where every corner still carried my son's laughter, nearly broke me. But his letter echoed in my mind. Protect what's ours. He had not asked me to preserve walls or chandeliers. He had asked me to protect what mattered, the wealth, the security, the legacy. I lifted my eyes. Yes, I said softly, begin the process, and no one must know, especially not her. He nodded, sliding the folder back into his briefcase. Discretion will be absolute, he assured me. I will contact only those who have handled transactions of this scale before, individuals with no ties to your family. The sale can be completed in weeks if you desire. I exhaled, feeling a strange mixture of fear and exhilaration. Weeks, I repeated. Yes. When I rose to leave, he placed a hand gently over mine. You must continue your performance, he said knowingly. Let her see only what she expects, an aging mother too weary to fight. I gave a thin smile. That role I have been playing well. She thinks I am defeated already. Outside, the sky was gray again, the city wet with the sheen of rain. I climbed back into the car, adjusting my shawl, my face carefully composed in the reflection of the window. When I returned home, Vivian would ask about my health, about what the doctor had said. I would lower my eyes, speak with a tired voice, and she would nod with satisfaction. She would not suspect that behind my silence, plans were already in motion. As the car pulled through the streets, I pressed my hand against the pocket of my coat where Alexander's letter rested, folded and worn. It was no longer just grief I carried. It was a shield, a command, and now a strategy. I would protect what was ours, and I would do it while the world believed I was too fragile to act at all. The weeks that followed turned the mansion into a stage for Vivian's vanity. She filled the rooms with her friends almost every evening, the air thick with perfume and the clink of champagne glasses. She laughed too loudly, her voice carrying down the corridors where I wandered in silence. At the table she spoke of travel plans, of investments she and her lover were preparing, of the bright future that awaited her. She reveled in her performance as mistress of the house, and every boast cut deeper into me, though I let my face show only weariness. Her arrogance grew unchecked. I heard her on the phone one afternoon, walking through the great hall as though the walls themselves should listen. This estate is mine, she declared. The company shares will soon be in my hands. With the right moves, we'll be unstoppable. Her words rang cruel against the marble, careless of who might overhear. I paused in the doorway, my shawl tight around me, appearing small, invisible, but inside my heart clenched with rage I would not reveal. Relatives began to whisper when they visited. Over tea, one cousin leaned close, her eyes sharp with confusion. Why don't you demand your rights, Catherine? This is your home. Others echoed her doubts, their voices hushed yet insistent. But each time I lowered my gaze, folded my hands, and answered nothing. Let them believe I was too frail, too broken, too timid to fight. It was the role I had chosen, and I would not abandon it until the time was right. Vivian took my silence as surrender. She strutted across the rooms in high heels, trailing expensive fabrics, her arm often linked with her lover's. Together they examined the paintings, the sculptures, the chandeliers, discussing their value with the cold interest of merchants. Once, in front of me, she told her guests, "Soon I'll have the papers finalized. This house will carry only my name." They applauded her, glasses raised, and she smiled as though already victorious. I remained at the edges, watching, learning. Each insult sharpened the resolve within me. Each careless laugh from her lips made Alexander's words echo louder in my memory. "Protect what's ours." My silence was not weakness, it was a shield. I allowed her to parade her triumph because I knew the truth that burned quietly in my possession, a truth sealed in legal documents and my son's final letter. So I endured the questions, the whispers, the pity. Let her enjoy her stage, let her squander her dignity in front of those who only half believed her. In the shadows I kept my part, the grieving mother who seemed too old to fight. Yet with every passing day, while she built her fragile kingdom on arrogance, I prepared for the moment it would all crumble. Vivian moved through the house like a monarch awaiting her coronation. She walked the marble halls with her chin lifted, rehearsing in her mind the moment the lawyer would arrive to confirm what she already believed, that the mansion, the shares, the wealth, all of it was hers. She told her friends to prepare for a celebration, spoke of renovations still grander than the ones she had begun, and her voice carried a confidence so absolute it was almost intoxicating. She never once looked at me with doubt. In her eyes, I was finished, a fragile old woman who clung to shadows. The household adjusted to her rhythm. Servants obeyed her commands, guests echoed her laughter, and the evenings hummed with her triumph. Yet beneath the glitter and noise, tension coiled like a snake ready to strike. The walls themselves seemed to hold their breath, as though they too knew a storm was gathering. I kept my silence, moving through the rooms like a ghost, my shawl pulled tight, my footsteps careful. No one noticed the fire building behind my eyes. Every night, when the parties ended and the house grew quiet, I withdrew to the study, closing the door behind me. There, under the soft glow of the lamp, I reviewed the contracts Mr. Harland had prepared. Each page carried the weight of strategy, each signature line a path toward freedom. The sale of the mansion was nearly complete. Buyers discreet and powerful had already committed, their funds ready to transfer. One more week, perhaps less, and Vivian's palace would no longer be hers to command. I folded the documents carefully and hid them where no careless eye would find them. Vivian believed all was secure, that the law itself would soon place the crown on her head. She spoke often of the day the attorney would stand in this very hall, proclaiming her the rightful heir. She imagined the applause, the congratulations, the wealth at her command. She saw herself untouchable. I let her dream. I nodded faintly when she boasted, lowered my eyes when she gloated, and kept my voice frail when relatives asked questions. She must believe the part I played, the grieving mother, too broken to resist. Yet with each passing day my resolve tightened, and Alexander's words pulsed like blood in my veins. "Protect what's ours." The house was quiet one evening after a storm. The air smelled of wet stone and pine. Vivian sat with her lover in the great room, their laughter soft and indulgent, as they toasted a future they thought already secure. I watched from the shadows of the corridor, unseen, unheard, but unyielding. My time was coming. The silence of the mansion was deceptive, like the stillness before thunder. Every surface gleamed, every room echoed with her confidence, but beneath it lay the truth she could not see. The final move was nearly ready. Soon, when the curtain lifted, she would learn that the game she thought she had won was never hers at all. The evening began with the glitter of crystal glasses and the low hum of violins playing from hidden speakers. Vivian had decided the mansion needed a cocktail gathering, small but glamorous, a chance for her to parade herself as the rightful mistress of the estate. Guests spilled across the marble floors, laughter ricocheting off gilded mirrors, the air heavy with the scent of perfume and expensive liquor. She welcomed them at the grand staircase, her hand resting on the polished banister as though it had been hers since birth. I lingered upstairs in silence, my body bent slightly with age, the shawl around my shoulders drawn close. From the shadows of the balcony I looked down, unseen, a ghost in my own home. They did not glance up, not once. Vivian wanted them to believe this was her empire, and they were eager enough to oblige. The tables were dressed with silver trays of hors d'oeuvres, the kind Alexander had never cared for but that Vivian insisted upon. Champagne flutes sparkled in every hand. She moved among her friends in a silk gown, every gesture practiced, every smile sharp. At one point she raised her glass and spoke loudly enough for the music to dim around her. "This place is my empire now," she declared. The room erupted in claps and cheers, the sound shallow and theatrical. I gripped the railing above, my knuckles white, but I did not speak. Her lover stood near the fireplace, a glass of whiskey in his hand, watching her with approval that made bile rise in my throat. He was comfortable now, too comfortable, speaking to her friends as though he had always belonged here. I could hear the arrogance in his laugh, even from above. Vivian drifted back to him, touching his arm lightly, whispering words that made him grin like a man already rich. One of the women, draped in diamonds, leaned closer to Vivian with a curious tilt of her head. "But what about your mother-in-law?" she asked, her tone almost playful. For a moment the room quieted, the question hanging like smoke. Vivian's answer came with a smile too thin to hide her disdain. "She's just staying here temporarily," she said. "Soon she'll be out." The crowd chuckled, some nervously, some delighted by her boldness. My heart twisted, yet my face remained calm in the shadows. From my place at the railing, I watched her sip champagne, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of a conqueror. Every word, every gesture was another brick she laid in the walls of her arrogance. She believed herself invincible, untouchable, the queen of a kingdom she thought was secured. She had no idea that with each boast, with each careless laugh, she was tightening the noose around her own neck. I stood there quietly, letting them forget I existed. They spoke freely because they believed I was powerless. They celebrated because they thought the house already theirs. But in the silence of my vigil, I carried the truth. The contracts were nearly ready, the signatures awaited, and soon this empire she flaunted would slip from her hands. The music swelled again, glasses clinked, and Vivian laughed louder than all the rest, the sound echoing against the vaulted ceilings. I leaned against the banister, my figure frail, my shoulders bowed, but my eyes never left her. I let her dance in her illusion, let her friends applaud her triumph. They did not see me above them, silent and steady, watching as she built the stage for her own fall. The family gathered in the great hall, the chandeliers glowing above us, the long table gleaming with polished wood. Mr. Harland, dignified as ever, had called the meeting for the official reading of Alexander's will. The air was thick with anticipation, each relative seated with stiff posture, glancing at one another with curiosity. Vivian entered last, her heels clicking proudly against the marble, her silk gown trailing like a banner of conquest. On her arm was the man everyone pretended not to see, her lover, bold as brass, a living insult to my son's memory. She paraded him in as if to make her dominance undeniable. She took her seat near the center, head high, lips curved in the faintest smirk. Her eyes darted briefly toward me at the far end of the table, a glance filled with condescension, before turning back to the lawyer as if she were about to receive her crown. Guests murmured, some uncomfortable, some already resigned to her triumph. I sat silently, hands folded, the shawl tight around my shoulders, my gaze lowered. Mr. Harland cleared his throat, his voice steady, echoing across the hall. "Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for assembling. We are here to honor the wishes of the late Mr. Alexander Pierce." He opened the leather folder and drew out a stack of documents. Vivian leaned forward, her smile broadening. As of the date before his passing, Mr. Harland continued. All assets belonging to Mr. Pierce, including this residence, the majority of his company shares and financial accounts, were transferred into the sole ownership of his mother, Lady Catherine Whitmore. The words fell like a stone in still water, ripples of shock spreading instantly. A fork clattered to the floor, a gasp broke from one of the cousins. All eyes turned to Vivian. Her expression froze, the color draining from her cheeks. "That's impossible," she stammered. "He would never—" But the lawyer raised a hand, calm but firm. The documents are here, signed and notarized. Mrs. Caldwell, as the widow, you are entitled only to personal gifts he gave you during his lifetime. Nothing more. The silence was deafening, broken only by the faint rustle of papers. Vivian's lover shifted uncomfortably beside her, but she shot him a warning glance. She opened her mouth again, ready to lash out, but Mr. Harland interrupted. "There is more," he said gravely. Alexander left a personal message, recorded from the hospital in his final days. He wished it to be shown only in the presence of the family. He pressed a button on the laptop, and the screen flickered to life. My son appeared, sitting weakly against the pillows of a hospital bed, his face pale but his eyes steady. His voice, though thin, rang through the hall with clarity. "If you're seeing this, it means I'm gone. Everything I built, I owe to my mother. She stood by me when no one else did. That's why everything goes to her. As for my wife—" He paused, his chest rising with effort, but his gaze never faltered. "I wish her well, but she won't inherit what she tried to take by betrayal." Gasps swept the table. A few relatives crossed themselves, others shook their heads in disbelief. My own eyes blurred with tears, my son's voice cutting through grief like sunlight through storm clouds. Vivian's hand trembled, her face twisting between rage and humiliation. The lover lowered his gaze, unwilling to meet anyone's eyes. The video ended, leaving only silence. Mr. Harlan closed the laptop gently. "These are his wishes, beyond contestation. Lady Whitmore is the rightful heir." The words sealed the moment. My heart ached with sorrow, but also swelled with vindication. Alexander had spoken for me, louder than I ever could. Across the table, Vivian sat rigid, her empire crumbling before the eyes of everyone she had tried to dazzle. And I, still cloaked in the appearance of frailty, felt the steady burn of justice rising in my chest. For a long moment after the video ended, silence sat heavy over the hall. The chandeliers sparkled above us, their light cruelly bright against the tension that hung like smoke. Vivian's hand, still gripping the stem of her glass, trembled visibly. Then suddenly she sprang to her feet, her voice shattering the hush. "This is impossible!" she screamed, her face flushed red, her eyes wild. "This house is mine! He promised me!" Her cry echoed against the walls, shrill and desperate, shattering the composure she had so carefully cultivated. Her lover, seated close beside her, jumped up as well, trying to seize control of the scene. He raised his hand, his voice pitched to sound authoritative. "There must be some mistake," he insisted. "Alexander would never disinherit his wife like this." But even as he spoke, Mr. Harlan calmly slid another set of documents across the polished table. "Here are the transfers, signed, witnessed, and notarized. Everything is valid and binding." The man faltered, his bravado crumbling as quickly as it had flared. He glanced at the signatures, at the stamps of the notary, and then at Vivian, who clutched at his sleeve as though drowning. For a heartbeat he lingered, but when he saw the certainty in the lawyer's eyes, his courage fled. He stepped back, disentangling her fingers from his arm. Without another word, he turned on his heel and strode out of the hall, leaving her gasping, abandoned in front of everyone. Whispers rose like a tide around the table. Relatives exchanged glances heavy with disdain. Some shook their heads, others leaned together, their murmurs cutting like knives. She thought she could take everything. How shameless, how foolish. Friends who had laughed at her parties, drunk her wine, now looked at her with eyes sharpened by judgment. Vivian swayed on her feet, stripped of the armor of admiration she had so carefully gathered. Desperation drove her to her phone. With shaking hands she dialed the bank, her voice rising in panic. "This is Vivian Caldwell," she snapped. "I need confirmation of my loan application." The hall fell silent again as we all listened to the thin voice that answered from the other end. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Caldwell," the banker said firmly. "Your application has been rejected. The property is no longer eligible as collateral. Ownership has already been transferred." The line clicked dead. The words landed like a hammer. Vivian staggered back, nearly dropping the phone. Her eyes darted wildly from face to face, searching for someone to defend her, to deny what she had just heard. None did. Some of her so-called friends turned away, unwilling to share her humiliation. Others stared directly, their expressions edged with scorn. She clutched the phone to her chest, her voice breaking. He promised me. He told me this house would be mine. But no one answered. The only response was the steady rustle of whispers, the collective recoil of those who now saw her not as a widow to be pitied, but as a schemer exposed. I sat in silence at the far end of the table, watching as her empire collapsed in minutes. The strength I had hidden behind bowed shoulders stirred quietly within me. Alexander had spoken for me, the law had confirmed it, and Vivian's own arrogance had finished the work. She stood alone now, screaming in an echo chamber of her own making, her voice hollow against the truth that surrounded her. The hall buzzed with chaos, voices rising in disbelief and contempt, chairs scraping against the polished floor as relatives murmured among themselves. Vivian stood trembling, her face a mask of fury and humiliation, her phone still clutched like a useless weapon. Friends edged away from her, unwilling to share in the disgrace that clung to her like smoke. For a moment I remained seated, watching the storm swirl around her, the empire she had flaunted dissolving in front of everyone. Then I pushed back my chair and rose. The sound was not loud, but it drew every eye. I stood tall, though my body still bore the frailty of grief, my hands resting lightly on the table. My voice, when it came, was calm, steady, and it cut through the clamor like a blade. You told me to find my own place. I did, and I took our house with me. Gasps rippled down the table. Vivian's head snapped toward me, her lips parted, eyes blazing with disbelief. She opened her mouth to shout, but no sound came. I reached into the folds of my shawl and placed a simple envelope on the table, sliding it across the polished surface until it rested before her. The room stilled, curiosity choking the air. Her hands shook as she tore it open. Inside was not money, nor contracts, but a single folded letter. She unfolded it, her eyes scanning the neat handwriting. My voice filled the silence as she read. All you have left are the clothes and jewelry my son gave you. If you're lucky, you'll find someone worth loving, and maybe this time, don't destroy them like you did to him. Her face drained of color. The words hit harder than any legal decree. Whispers broke out again, sharp, unforgiving. She looked at me, but I did not look away. Slowly, deliberately, I gestured to the envelope again. There is one more thing. She drew out a Polaroid photograph, its edges worn, the colors faded but clear. Alexander stood smiling with his arm around me, the day he bought this house, pride shining in his eyes. On the back, in his unmistakable hand, were the words, "For Mom, always." The photograph slipped from her fingers, fluttering to the table. Gasps and murmurs filled the hall. Even those who had doubted now understood. This house had never been hers, not in his heart, not in his memory, not in his intention. Vivian swayed, her chest heaving, her mouth moving soundlessly. Around her, relatives exchanged looks of pity and contempt, some shaking their heads, others turning away entirely. The friends who had once toasted her victories avoided her eyes, edging toward the exits. Her lover was gone, the law was against her, and now even the memory of her husband rejected her. I stood still, letting the weight of the moment settle. Justice did not roar, it whispered, quiet and final. My son's voice seemed to echo in my chest. Protect what's ours. I had done it. Vivian sank into her chair, her hands limp at her sides, the letter and the photograph lying before her like verdicts carved in stone. The empire she had claimed crumbled not with fire, but with truth. I turned from the table, my steps slow but sure. Behind me the hall filled with murmurs, not of scorn directed at me anymore, but of respect, even awe. The house was mine, not by law alone, but by memory, by love, by his final promise. And for the first time since his death, I felt the faintest weight lift from my heart. Vivian's knees gave way, and she collapsed onto the polished marble floor. Her sobs tore through the silence, raw and unrestrained, as mascara streaked her cheeks and her jeweled hands clawed at the air for help that would not come. but no one moved. One by one, her friends, once so eager to bask in her glow, slipped quietly toward the doors. Their laughter had dried up, replaced by uneasy glances, their high heels clicking against stone as they disappeared into the night. The great hall emptied, leaving only whispers that trailed like smoke and the broken figure of a woman who had lost everything. She cried out names, pleaded with voices that no longer answered. Even family turned their faces away, unwilling to share her disgrace. Her empire had collapsed, not with the thunder of defiance, but with the soft retreat of footsteps abandoning her, until she was surrounded by nothing but echoes and shame. I stood at the threshold, watching her crumble. My heart did not rejoice, yet it no longer carried pity. Justice had already spoken. There was nothing left for me here. With steady steps, I crossed the hall and passed through the great doors, the sound of her sobs fading behind me. Outside, the air was cold and clean, free of the stench of arrogance and deceit. The limousine waited at the edge of the driveway, its sleek black surface gleaming under the lamps. A driver held the door open as I approached, my small suitcase in hand. It was all I needed. I paused at the top of the steps, turning my eyes once more toward the mansion. Its windows glowed golden in the night, but to me they were no longer prison bars. They were simply walls of stone, empty of meaning. I looked at the house not with regret, but with release. The burden was gone, the chains of grief and humiliation loosened. Alexander's voice lingered in my memory, gentle and strong. Protect what's ours. I had. Now it was time to let go. I lowered myself into the car, the door closing softly, and as the engine hummed to life, I felt the faint stirrings of freedom rise within me. The sale of the mansion concluded with the quiet efficiency of a closing ceremony. Mr. Harland oversaw every detail, his voice calm, his paperwork precise, while I signed the last of the documents with a steady hand. Within days, the accounts reflected the transfer. The estate, the shares, the assets that Alexander had entrusted to me were liquidated into a fortune that glittered only as numbers on a screen. Yet the weight of it was tangible, as though my son's hand pressed against mine, reminding me that this was not theft nor charity, but his final wish. When the limousine came to take me away from New York, I carried so little it startled even the driver. No trunks of clothes, no crates of possessions, no jewels to flaunt. Only a single leather case rested at my side. Inside it were three things: the letter Alexander had written with his fading strength, the watch he had worn during the years of building his empire, and the Polaroid photograph from the day he bought our home. His young smile wrapped around me. The words, "For Mom," always, written in his hand. That was all I needed. The rest I had left behind, both the gilded walls that had once imprisoned me and the woman who had tried to erase me within them. As the plane lifted from the runway, the city spread beneath me in twilight, its skyscrapers gleaming like blades against the sky. I did not cry. The tears had long been exhausted. What I felt was a strange stillness, a calm that came not from forgetting but from release. Alexander's voice whispered in my memory, "Protect what's ours," and I realized I had done so. Now, the task was to live. When I arrived in Monte Carlo, the air smelled different, rich with salt and jasmine, the Mediterranean wind softer than any I had known. The taxi wound its way up the cliffside, and then the city revealed itself. Gleaming marinas filled with white yachts, narrow streets spilling with laughter, terraces glowing golden against the blue of the evening sea. My new home awaited at the top of a marble stairway, a penthouse overlooking the endless horizon. Inside, the space was open and luminous. The floors were veined marble, the walls painted in pale cream, the windows stretching from floor to ceiling. Beyond them lay the balcony, vast and commanding, with a view that seemed to swallow the entire Mediterranean. I stepped onto it as the sun began to sink, painting the water with crimson and gold. A chilled glass of champagne waited on the railing, and I lifted it slowly, the bubbles tickling my lips, the taste sharp and clean. The sea air wrapped around me, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, I breathed without heaviness. I stood there for a long time, the sunset unfurling like fire across the waves. My mind wandered to Alexander, to the way he used to tease me for never taking time for myself, for always working, always worrying. "You'll see the world one day, Mom," he had promised. I thought of that promise now as the city lights of Monaco flickered alive beneath me, dazzling against the fading sky. His gift had not only been wealth but freedom, the chance to step beyond grief into something larger, brighter. The next morning, I woke to the sound of gulls wheeling over the harbor. I dressed simply, a scarf wrapped against the breeze, and decided to walk down into the city. The streets were alive with color, flower stalls spilling roses and lavender, cafes buzzing with chatter, the distant hum of cars winding up the cliffs. I found myself drawn toward the waterfront, where the yachts were moored, their masts tall as cathedrals, their hulls gleaming like polished ivory. I sat at a cafe with tables lined along the cobblestones, ordering a small espresso that steamed in the morning air. From where I sat, the water shimmered with sunlight, and the laughter of children mingled with the clink of cutlery. It was a world away from the hollow banquets of New York, a place where life seemed to move not in shadows, but in light. As I sipped, I noticed a woman at the next table. She was perhaps close to my age, her silver hair tucked beneath a wide-brimmed hat, her jewelry understated but elegant. Her accent was thickly Italian when she leaned toward me with a smile. "You're new here, aren't you?" she asked, her eyes kind, curious. For a heartbeat, I froze, the old instinct to withdraw tightening in my chest. In New York, I had been surrounded by eyes filled with suspicion, pity, or disdain. But here there was no judgment in her gaze, only welcome. I returned the smile, tentative but real. "Yes," I answered quietly, "I suppose I am." Her laugh was soft, genuine. "Then you will learn quickly. This place, it is not for loneliness. Here, people live, they do not hide. You will see." She raised her cup in a small toast, and something warm flickered in me, fragile but undeniable. I lifted my espresso, meeting her gesture. "Perhaps that's why I came," I admitted. We clinked cups lightly, and in that simple sound I felt the first thread of something new weaving into my life. A friendship, perhaps, or simply the promise that I was no longer condemned to silence. As I turned my eyes back to the harbor, to the yachts and the sparkling sea, I realized that I had stepped into a chapter not defined by betrayal or grief, but by possibility. The Polaroid rested in my bag, its edges worn smooth, its message forever clear. For Mom. Always. I touched it briefly, a silent acknowledgement. I had carried his memory across an ocean, and here, in the golden air of Monaco, it no longer chained me to sorrow. It carried me forward, into a life I was finally ready to claim. Life in Monte Carlo unfolded with surprising softness, as though the city itself was determined to coax me back into the rhythm of living. At first I wandered its streets as an outsider, cautious, but soon I found myself drawn toward the places that invited creation. One morning I walked into a sunlit studio where canvases leaned against every wall and the smell of oils and turpentine hung in the air. The instructor, a cheerful Frenchman with paint smudged across his sleeves, welcomed me without hesitation. I sat before a blank canvas, brush trembling in my hand, and painted for the first time in decades. What emerged was not perfect, not even beautiful by ordinary standards, but it was mine. The outline of a boy's smile, the arch of the garden trees back in New York, the horizon of the Mediterranean, all tangled together. The hours passed without me noticing. My grief poured onto the canvas in colors, deep blues for sorrow, golds for memory, crimson streaks for the love that still pulsed in me. Other women painted beside me, some younger, some older, and they nodded gently as though they understood. Soon I began to return each week, each time leaving the studio lighter than before. In the afternoons I tried something I had always dreamed of but never dared: music. I enrolled in piano lessons, my fingers stiff at first, hesitant on the keys, but slowly growing confident. Sometimes I laughed aloud at the wrong notes, remembering how Alexander had once teased me for humming without melody. Other days I tried dancing, the steps clumsy but freeing, my body discovering movement again after years of being frozen in grief. There was joy in the imperfection, joy in allowing myself to be a student once more. It was during these classes that I met them, women close to my age, elegant, confident, each carrying her own story of survival. Some had lost husbands, others had walked away from families that had caged them. They were wealthy, independent, unafraid of the world's opinion. Together we formed an unlikely community, laughing over glasses of wine, strolling the markets, daring one another to live boldly. For the first time in years, I did not feel alone. Months passed, and one day I found myself invited to contribute to a small exhibition. I hesitated, but my friends insisted, so I chose a single painting, a canvas I had worked on quietly, late at night, inspired by the final letter Alexander had left me. In it, a mother's figure was painted in soft light, her hand reaching toward a horizon where the sun broke through dark clouds. Hidden in the colors were the words he had written, "Mom, I trust you," stroked faintly along the sky. The night of the exhibition, I stood in the gallery, the walls lined with art, the air buzzing with conversation. My painting hung modestly in the corner, but when a collector purchased it, I felt no pride of possession. Instead, I signed the papers and announced that all proceeds would go toward lung cancer research, the illness that had taken my son too soon. Gasps of admiration rippled through the crowd, but for me it was simple. It was love, transformed into something that might help another life. As I left the gallery that night, the sea wind brushed against my face, and I felt Alexander near me again, not as a wound, but as a guiding star. My life in Monaco was no longer only about survival. It was about building, creating, and honoring the memory of my son by living the way he had always wanted me to, fully, bravely, with joy. Back in New York, the city that once seemed to belong to her now turned its face away. Vivian walked the streets with her sunglasses drawn low, but no shade could hide the ruin etched across her features. The banks that had once taken her calls now dismissed her with curt politeness. The loan she had boasted about securing had vanished into smoke, her name whispered in boardrooms as a warning rather than an opportunity. Where she had once spoken with the arrogance of a queen, now no one invited her voice. Her lover, who had stood beside her with such confidence, disappeared as quickly as he had arrived. His final words had been cruel in their simplicity. "You have nothing left to offer me." The memory of his retreat, his back turning toward another life, replayed in her mind at night when she sat in the silence of her new apartment. The jewelry Alexander had once given her, once her pride, now lay scattered on a dresser she could barely afford, glinting faintly under a weak bulb as if mocking her. Friends drifted away one by one. The women who had clapped at her parties no longer returned her calls. The men who had raised glasses in her honor now crossed the street to avoid her gaze. Her name became something spoken behind hands, not with envy, but with disdain. The empire she had claimed so loudly crumbled without ceremony, leaving behind only unpaid bills and unanswered messages. Her new home was a far cry from the marble halls she had once demanded. A single-bedroom apartment on the edge of the city, walls stained with age, windows that rattled when the subway passed beneath. She sat often on the narrow bed, staring at the peeling paint, the echo of laughter long gone. Outside, the city hummed with indifference, its neon lights far removed from the golden glow she had once imagined would surround her forever. It was here, in the quiet of her decline, that the contrast sharpened. Far across the ocean, under the Mediterranean sun, Lady Catherine sipped champagne on a marble balcony, her laughter mingling with new friends, her days filled with color and creation. The Riviera sky opened wide above her, its warmth a balm to years of grief. Meanwhile, Vivian huddled in her dim apartment, clutching at bills she could not pay. Her nights stretched long with silence and shame. She tried once to call one of the bankers again, her voice shaking, asking for leniency. The answer was cold. "Your collateral is gone, Mrs. Caldwell." There is nothing more we can do." The line went dead, leaving her staring at her phone as if it too had abandoned her. She tossed it aside, the screen cracking against the wall, and buried her face in her hands. The woman who had strutted through marble corridors now found herself alone, her footsteps echoing only against linoleum floors. The woman who had declared an empire now sat queen of nothing but shadows. And as the nights grew colder, she realized that the betrayal she had sown had returned to her in full measure. Somewhere in Monaco, Catherine raised a glass to the horizon, the sea reflecting fire and gold. In New York, Vivian sat in darkness, her empire reduced to ashes, her crown dissolved into memory. Two women bound by one man's love, now divided forever, one redeemed by loyalty, the other condemned by greed. The night had settled over Monaco with a kind of velvet softness, the harbor below glittering with the reflections of 100 lights from the yachts anchored in still water. From the balcony of my penthouse, the air was warm with a salty breeze, carrying the distant laughter of strangers drifting up from the cafes along the port. I sat quietly, the city alive beneath me, a glass of champagne glowing golden in my hand. The bubbles rose slowly, catching the lamplight, and I watched them with a calm I had not known in years. I leaned back into the chair, letting the marble beneath my feet cool the warmth of the day. The sea stretched endlessly, dark blue and eternal, the horizon blurred into starlight. My heart was not filled with triumph, though triumph had been earned. It was not even filled with revenge, though revenge had been exacted. What lingered now was something purer, something lighter. It was release. I thought of the woman I had been in New York, hunched beneath the weight of scorn, treated as fragile, as expendable. I thought of Vivian's cruel laughter echoing through halls that no longer belonged to her, her voice dripping with disdain as she told me to find my own place. And I had. But what she never understood was that in forcing me out, she had set me free. The empire she tried to seize had become her prison. The empire my son left me had become my liberation. Wealth was part of it, yes, but it was not the money that freed me. It was the choice, the ability to step into the world unafraid. I lifted the glass slowly, the cool crystal pressing against my fingers, and drank. The champagne was sharp and alive, and in that taste I felt both memory and future. Alexander's face came to me, not in grief, but in warmth. The smile on the Polaroid, the words he had written on its back. For Mom, always. I whispered them into the night, and for the first time they did not bring tears. They brought peace. Beside me on the small table lay a leather-bound notebook, its cover still stiff from being new. The pen rested across it like a promise. I opened it gently, letting the pages breathe against the breeze. On the very first page, in my own hand, I had written the words, "For him, for me, a new life begins." I read the line once more, and it struck me with the weight of truth. My life until now had been lived for others, first for my family, then for my son, then in silence beneath the cruelty of a woman who had tried to erase me. But now, at last, I had carved a space where living belonged to me. The grief would never disappear entirely, nor should it. But grief had given way to something sturdier, a foundation on which to build again. The waves whispered against the shore below, the city shimmered, and I felt the curve of a smile rise slowly across my lips. It was not the forced smile of endurance, nor the brittle smile of defiance. It was quiet, tender, the smile of a woman who had endured ruin and betrayal and emerged not as a victim, but as herself. The night stretched infinite before me, full of unknowns, and I no longer feared them. With the notebook open, the pen waiting, the champagne warm in my hand, I knew that this was not the end of anything. It was the beginning. If this story touched you, take a moment to reflect on the quiet strength we often overlook in ourselves and in those around us. Share this tale with someone who might need a reminder that dignity, justice, and renewal are always possible, no matter the weight of betrayal or grief. Let it inspire you to protect what truly matters, to cherish the bonds that endure, and to believe that it is never too late to begin again. And if you carry a dream long buried, Perhaps tonight is the moment to set it free.